What's up, guys? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran. I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, and today we're going to be taking a look at sanctions against Iran. All right, Alexander, we've got Iran back on the bad list, the bad state actor list,
Yeah.
and the sanctions are now, I guess, in full effect. We just recently heard that the SWIFT system will be blocking them, so they won't be able to do any banking transactions via SWIFT. And there's been many analysts who have said that these sanctions now, or this slow run-up to these sanctions, may not work, may not be effective because the U.S. doesn't wield as much power on the international scene as it once did, and that Europe is also going to, push back on them, and they'll find ways to move around them. You have a different take on Trump's and the White House, the administration's sanctions plan with Iran and its effectiveness. What's your opinion on this?
Yes. I mean, I take a vastly more, shall we say, pessimistic view about the sanctions than some people do. Now, I say pessimistic because I think an awful lot of people around the world, a lot of the analysts that you're referring to, want the sanctions to fail. They want them to fail for all sorts of reasons, either because they support the JCPOA, the joint, the anti-nuclear agreement that Iran negotiated with the United States and the other members of the world community, or they don't like Donald Trump and they don't want him to succeed, or they don't like the sanctions policy the US applies generally. So I think that they are looking at various protestations which come from various countries, especially in Europe, which say, we don't like these sanctions, and we're going to set up all these mechanisms to try to block them and to try to continue to work with Iran. And they also look at some of these waivers that the United States has now granted to certain countries to allow them to buy oil from Iran for a certain period. And they say to themselves, well, these sanctions are not going to work. I'm afraid I disagree completely. I think these sanctions economically are going to work very effectively. I don't see Iran being able to continue its oil exports in the way that it previously did. There will be some trickle of oil coming out of Iran through smuggling, but I think the idea that Iran will be able to continue to export oil to countries like India and China and to the European Union unhindered is completely fantastic. And as we've seen, already steps are happening by Western companies and even by Chinese companies to disengage from Iran. And if I can explain why all this is happening, it is because all of these companies, these big international companies which trade with Iran, including the European companies, including the Chinese companies, also trade with the United States. And they do not want to be blocked out of the US market. It is far more important to them, immeasurably more important to them than Iran. They are not going to risk their access to the US because they want to trade with Iran. So they are all leaving, and they are all going to enforce the sanctions. And European governments are not going to change that. The Chinese government may, but only to a very small extent. And that is the reality that people have to recognize when they talk about the sanctions, and not, I think, indulge in some of the wishful thinking they have been doing.
Europe has been talking a very big game, but would you say that this is going to expose how weak Europe and the European Union truly is in the shadow of U.S. dictate and demands?
Absolutely. Let us look at this. I mean, first of all, the Europeans said that they would want to continue to see their companies trade with Iran. Well, all the European companies, Daimler, Total, the French oil major, all of these which were involved in Iran on a big scale are now leaving Iran because, as I said, for them, they want to trade with the US. The Europeans said that they refused to allow SWIFT, this is the interbank payment system, which is based in Brussels and which is regulated by European Union law. They said they wouldn't ask SWIFT to cut off Iranian banks. SWIFT did it anyway because it doesn't want to be sanctioned by the US, and many of the companies that operate through SWIFT and which are represented on its board are American banks. So SWIFT has done it regardless of what the Europeans think. And the Europeans have been talking a very big game, as you rightly say, about setting up an alternative payment mechanism separate from SWIFT, which will allow financial dealings with Iran. And there's been an awful lot of talk, and there has been absolutely no action. And the reason there's been no action is because, of course, European banks and European companies don't want to have anything to do with it. And some of the countries in the European Union, like Poland, like the Baltic states, are opposed to it as well. So the Europeans have come out of this looking utterly toothless. And may I say, that is exactly what I said would happen when we first heard that the US was going to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions many months ago. You can go to my article on the Duran about it.
All right, well, we'll link that article in the description box down below so people can read your analysis there and to see that your prediction did actually come true.
Yeah.
Where does this leave Iran? What options does it have?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's got to face that it's going to, over the next couple of years, be under severe economic siege. I don't think there's any question about this. Moreover, I don't think Iran can make the kind of concessions that the US is demanding of Iran, because if you look at those concessions, they are so sweeping that if the Iranians made them, I think it would destabilize their political system. So what the Iranians need to do is, first of all, Iran is a big country. It's got a lot of resources. They need to use those resources a lot more efficiently than they have been doing in order to try to keep their economy going. And the other thing they've got to do is they've got to work with the one country that probably is in a position to continue trading with them, and which for all sorts of reasons is much more immune to the kind of sanctions pressure we've been seeing than almost any other country is, and that is Russia. The Russians have a big, self-sufficient, highly developed economy. They have their own payment system, like SWIFT. They have their own financial system with its own debit card, which is the Mir debit card. They have banks and companies which, unlike nearly all other international companies, don't do much work with the United States, and many of which have been sanctioned anyway. And I think the Iranians need to start working far more systematically to build up the economic links with the Russians that the Russians have always offered them, but which the Iranians themselves, for their own very good reasons, have been resistant to making.
What about China?
Well, I think the Chinese will do some things. I mean, China is a huge country. It's an immense economy, much bigger than Russia's. And, of course, there are lots of Chinese companies, some of them fairly small companies, which will probably be prepared to continue to work with Iran to some degree. The major problem that China has is importing oil from Iran. I think the Chinese are going to be very resistant to doing this because the Chinese oil companies are themselves international oil companies which want to avoid being sanctioned by the US. And there were reports coming out over the last few days which appeared to confirm that they have actually stopped buying Iranian oil. That is the reality we have to look at. So the Chinese will be involved. I think there'll be some Indian companies involved. I think there'll be some Turkish companies. I think there'll be some Pakistani companies which will continue to deal to some extent with Iran. But the big economy that Iran now must look to, the economy that can provide Iran with capital, with technology, with a market for its goods, which is already said that it's prepared to exchange Iranian oil for finished products is Russia. And that's where the Iranians need to focus now.
How much of a fit, though, is Russia with Iran? Number one, I mean, they're both energy producing countries. Obviously, Russia makes many more things, but are they a natural fit? Like, say, a Russia-China is a much more natural fit. And do you foresee, perhaps at the G20, Trump may be dangling a carrot to Putin, saying, "Look, we'll ease up our sanctions against you if you don't support the Iran, prop up the Iran government"?
Right, now, to answer your two questions, firstly, Iran and Russia are by no means an obvious or ideal fit. I mean, Russia it's got powerful industries and powerful technology, but I mean, it can produce essentially most of the goods. It doesn't have to trade with Iran. If it trades with Iran in the way I said, it will do so for geopolitical reasons. Certainly, it will gain something from doing so because, I mean, that Iran is not a country without resources. But it would be a geopolitical step, and it would be something that would have to be developed because at the moment, the trade between Russia and Iran is not very great, and there are not even very good transport links between the two countries. But it is a country that does have a geopolitical interest in seeing a stable Iran in its southern, near to its southern border. It doesn't want to see the Iranian political system collapse. It doesn't want to see instability in Iran, and it probably absolutely doesn't want the United States moving in there. So for that reason, the Russians will probably want to help the Iranians at least a certain degree. Now, I am absolutely sure that Donald Trump will try to dangle some sanctions relief to the Russians in return for help with Iran. In fact, he's almost essentially already said that. I think there are going to be many Russians, particularly in the business community, who will be tempted by this. I personally think that ultimately the geopolitical imperative that I just talked about for Russia are wanting a stable and friendly Iran rather than an unstable Iran, which might be ultimately exposed to penetration by the United States. I think that geopolitical imperative will trump it. I think the Russians will say to themselves, we can withstand the US sanctions pressure. We've been able to do it up to now. We are building successful economic trading links with China and with the other Far Eastern economies. We're even seeing our trade with the European Union revive to a certain degree. We don't have to, therefore, go down the route of sanctions relief. And for that reason, we will stick by Iran because it is in our geopolitical interests to do so. But the Iranians need to understand that they are playing from a weak hand.
And so a weak Iran, does it not leave it open to Israel? Yes. I don't want to say an Israeli attack, but Israeli meddling. Does it not leave it open to regime change possibilities? What is the prognosis for Iran going forward, especially as it gets weaker and weaker as more countries abandon it, the European Union, China, etc., as more countries start to move away from Iran because, in essence, what Trump has made it is kind of toxic. I mean, the U.S. has made Iran toxic to deal with.
Exactly. Now, I mean, this is the big unanswered question. It depends very much on how strong the political system is in Iran and how loyal the Iranian population are to the political system in Iran. I am not an Iranian expert. My gut feeling is that there is a critical mass of people in Iran who support the present system and who will continue to do so despite the economic siege that the country is going to be put under. And you're absolutely right to say that it will not just be an economic economic siege. We're going to see all the regime change machinery that we've seen deployed in so many other places now being turned on Iran with a vengeance. It will be a great test of Iran to see if it can withstand it. And of course, I talked about Iran's need to improve its relations with Russia, and it really needs to do that, and it needs to work on that right now. But precisely because there are so many unresolved economic problems between Iran and Russia, like the fact that, as I said, there are no very good transport links between the two countries, even if the Iranians put all their efforts into sorting them out now, realistically, it's not going to make a dramatic difference for at least a couple of years. The Russians will be able to help now to some degree by exchanging Iranian oil for Russian goods. But if you're looking for an economic breakthrough, which will be able to show to the US and to other countries that the sanctions pressure has failed, the Iranians will not see that for some years, and they need to be prepared for that, and they need to prepare themselves for the siege which is to come.
Do you think that Iran is going to be able, if you had to make another prediction, do you think that Iran is going to be able to weather this siege?
Yes, I think on balance it probably will. I should say that applying sanctions pressure in this way on a country like Iran does in some respects tend to consolidate support for the Iranian, for a political system. And I would expect that to happen to Iran also. In addition, Iran has experience of withstanding pressure. I mean, we mustn't forget that in the 1980s, it withstood an absolutely terrible war that was waged against it by Iraq, by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, with the support of the Arab world and the Western powers, and at times the Soviet Union. So, you know, Iran is not without resources. And if one knows Iranian people, I mean, it does have a cadre of highly educated and very competent managers and administrators and engineers who it could call upon in a crisis to help it through. But this would be a big test of the Iranian leadership and of the Iranian people. And we'll just have to see. On balance, I think Iran will pull through. But I'm not going to pretend that I am confident or certain that it will.
And finally, Alexander, one quick observation. How much of this do you think is John Bolton's doing? Do you think John Bolton is pushing this? My hunch is that if he can take down Iran, that would be a pretty big scalp for him to showcase as a neocon.
I've no doubt that he's absolutely the main driver of this. And you're absolutely right. If he can bring down Iran, that is, for him, the greatest achievement of his career up to now. And I mean, it would be difficult to imagine how he could cap that. The one thing I would say, though, is that, of course, Bolton is pushing on an open door in a sense, because Donald Trump has made it absolutely clear since before he was elected that he really, really doesn't like Iran. I mean, he is extremely antagonistic to Iran. He's extremely antagonistic to the nuclear deal that Iran made. And so, in a sense, Bolton has not had much persuasion to do.
That's what makes Bolton such a cunning diplomat. He knows, he saw the opportunity. He saw the open door.
He did, absolutely. He did. And when I mean, you refer to him as a diplomat, which in many respects, of course, he is. But, of course, he's also a supremely able bureaucrat. I mean, he knows how to pull strings. He knows how to use the machinery of the National Security Council of the United States in order to promote the agenda that he wants. And, of course, he's pulling all the levers and pulling all the strings, and he knows how to do it, and he's doing it very well. But I think it's important again to stress he is not out of step with Donald Trump on this.
Yeah, I think that's very important to stress. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much for your analysis on Iran and sanctions placed on Iran. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. And visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. And in the description box down below, you'll find links to our PayPal and Patreon pages. Please donate. It really helps us out a lot. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much for breaking down the situation in Iran. Until next time, take care.